Welcome to Athens Happens. I'm Ben Peters, a news editor at The New Political. Athens Happens is a weekly news podcast brought to you by TNP reporters dedicated to explaining the nuances of Athens and state politics. You can find new episodes every Friday at thenewpolitical.com, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, or wherever else podcasts can be downloaded. In this special episode of Athens Happens, I sat down with former independent, self-described Democratic Socialist mayoral candidate Damon Krane to discuss his political history, reflect on what he did and did not work in his mayoral campaign, speculate possible reasons why he was handily defeated by Athens Mayor Steve Patterson, and hear what's next for him. So I'm here in the Schoonover podcast studio. It is November 13th. We're here with former independent mayoral candidate Damon Krane. How are you, Damon?
Doing well, Ben. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I wanted to do just, learn a little bit about you first before we get into your mayoral campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Did I say mayoral in the 2 minutes ago? Okay. Thank God. So what brought you to Athens?
So I originally came to Athens back in 1999 when I was 19 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I actually didn't come here to go to school, although I did transfer to OU once I got here. At the time, I had, along with a high school friend of mine, co-founded a group called Free Student Press, and its purpose was to work with high school students in public schools to inform them of their little-known First Amendment press rights to produce their own publications, their own print media,
Mm-hmm.
and to distribute them at school during school hours without having to give editorial control to school officials.
Okay. And was that at Ohio University?
Yeah, so basically, a friend and I had done a public access zine like that when we were in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and then we just assumed that we had no legal protection to do that. We were just trying to fly under the radar.
Yeah.
Then I was going to college initially to be a high school social studies teacher, did a research project, found out that
Mm-hmm.
students have had legal protection to do that since the late 60s. The problem is no one ever tells them that. And oftentimes school officials do misinform them of their First Amendment press rights. So we felt that while there were groups like the ACLU and the Student Press Law Center
Mm-hmm.
that were great educational resources if you sought them out, what was missing was a group to really go out there and meet with students out in the field, reach out to students. And so my friend and I came up with an idea of an organization to do that, and she wanted to do it as a credited 6-month field study for her major. The only way her school would go along with that was if we were affiliated with a more established organization. And after sending out a bunch of proposals, there was a group called the Institute for Democracy and Education that was based in Athens that invited us to come here and do it. So my friend Lisa was here for 6 months, and I'm here 20 years later.
Yeah. So you said that you wanted to go to school to be a history teacher?
Social studies teacher initially.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what deterred you from that, I guess? Or did you end up going through with that?
Well, I got into a lot of radical pedagogy, people like John Dewey, Paulo Freire, and got more interested in educational spaces that were created within social movements. And so kind of a more empowering grassroots education rooted in people's experience and in their desire to have more control over their own lives. So I got more interested in education and social movements, and then just social movements more generally, and so gravitated more towards just grassroots organizing and politics.
Okay, so what then, you begun this, kind of low-key career in local politics with your friend from high school. What then got you into democratic socialism particularly?
Oh, I mean, I've probably been a socialist, since I was about 17 or 18.
Mm-hmm.
And initially was more attracted to probably the anarcho-syndicalist end of it as opposed to Marxism, which is a lot more people's gateway to socialist politics. And, it was just, I think, a combination of my early organizing experiences
Mm-hmm.
and learning that people could be very productive without a central authority figure dictating their course, that there was kind of this potential for real direct democracy that we don't get to experience much of in life. And given that, there was the possibility for much more equitable relations and institutions than we have. And I think once you start questioning the lack of democracy we find in our world, I think that's primarily going to lead you back to capitalism. And so I think as soon as you start thinking about those things, personally, I think that if you think seriously and long enough, you end up a socialist.
And so why do you think that your brand of democratic socialism is what's good for Athens?
Well, okay, two things I'll say to that. One, I mean, democratic socialism is a very broad umbrella.
Right.
So, for instance, even the Democratic Socialists of America have a libertarian socialist caucus. That's the anarchists. They've got Marxists too, a lot of folks of different tendencies. And so for me, and even democratic socialism has meant different things over the years.
Right.
When it was initially created and there were folks like Michael Harrington pushing it, it was really an idea of electoralism, this idea that we will be able to elect our way to socialism within the political institutions of contemporary capitalist democracy, that we either don't need revolutionary upheaval or it's impossible to achieve socialism that way. And I think that the term now is much broader than that. I think it simply means that I mean, it's redundant. I mean, because socialism is essentially economic democracy, but unfortunately, a lot of things have been called socialism in the past that weren't terribly democratic, and therefore, in my opinion, weren't socialist. So it's just emphasizing that we want an alternative to capitalism that is radically democratic.
So a Bernie Sanders-esque model.
Well, okay, so that's the second part. I mean, what Bernie Sanders has been proposing as far as a policy agenda goes is not socialism. It's just New Deal liberalism or Nordic social democracy. He's not talking about an alternative to capitalism. He's just talking about regulation in the public interest, progressive taxation, a robust social safety net, all of the things that we see in the Nordic countries that are still capitalist. And I think that's exactly what we need to be pushing for right now. I think that if you're a socialist, that's what you should be pushing for next. But I don't think that that is any kind of end in itself that any socialist would call socialism.
Okay.
But bringing back everything to local politics, I think that's even more the case. I mean, for instance, Operation Slumlord Smackdown, that was not a blueprint for socialism.
Can you explain what that is real quick to everybody?
So essentially, it was simply a plan for regulating the local rental market in the public interest. Something that is not at all radical, is not even on the far left of the Democratic Party, something which just about anywhere but Athens or a town like Athens would be absolute milquetoast, middle-of-the-road, liberal democratic policy agenda. And the fact that it is so vehemently opposed by a government which has been controlled by Democrats for decades, I think shows just how unusually far to the right our local Democratic Party is. Look at, and I'll give an overview of the whole package of proposals that is Operation Slumlord Smackdown. But for instance, one element of it is rent control. Well, who's pushing rent control on the national stage? Democrats. You know, Democrats passed statewide rent control in Oregon. They passed it in California. Kamala Harris spoke positively about the Oregon law. Bernie Sanders has proposed a national rent control plan. But here, Democrats oppose rent control. So I think that the reason that you only see socialists pushing for policies in Athens that elsewhere just mainstream Democrats would be pushing for shows how far to the right our local Democratic Party is. So Operation Slumlord Smackdown, to come back to your question there, it was a fairly detailed plan for improving not only rental housing conditions and affordability, but also affordable home buying. Because here the house sale market is rooted in the rental market. Because if you're selling a house that has the potential to generate profit, you know, if somebody's going to live in a house, yeah, it's appreciating about 4% per year, but you're not making a profit every month, every year off of that. If you rent it, you can. Okay, and something that generates profit for you is much more valuable than something that you just live in. So you see all of the houses below about $200,000, $250,000 priced according to the rental market and how much income they can generate for landlords. That makes them out of the price range of moderate income single families. But because we also don't enforce the housing code, it also means that these properties are incredibly run down. So if you were going to buy a property to live in yourself, you'd immediately have to dump another 50 grand in it. But if you're just going to rent it out to students and you know that the code will never be enforced, you can get away with selling it for a high price because it's very profitable. So Operation Slumlord Smackdown really, I think, was also more of an affordable home buying program than anything that our current city government has put forward. But it would do a few things primarily. One, it would increase the rental permit fee in order to enable hiring 4 additional rental housing inspectors who would then be able to actually enforce our city housing code, because right now the code office is just designed to fail. It's woefully understaffed.
Can I stop you for a sec?
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
mentioned that code enforcement is not enforced in Athens. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So we currently, the number was just increased a couple months ago. I believe we have somewhere around 5,680 registered rental units in the city of Athens. We have 4 people who inspect those, and only 3 of them are performing the inspections at any one point in time, while the 4th takes a turn doing the paperwork. Okay, and so according to our housing code, each of those units is to be inspected once per year. But on top of those regular inspections, you have additional follow-up inspections in cases where violations have been identified. Then code has to come back and inspect again to see if they've been corrected. And you also have inspections that are initiated by tenant complaint. So it's not part of the regular schedule, but somebody calls up the code offices and is like, as I've had to do, for instance, you know, it's 20 degrees outside, my furnace is broken, my landlord won't fix it. Then code comes in and says, yeah, your furnace is broken, and they order the landlord to fix it. If you add up all of those inspections, in 2018, there were over 8,000 inspections performed. In 2017, there were 10,000 inspections performed by just 3 people. So what that means is that each individual inspection is very short. And code is very upfront about this. In their annual report, they say that due to having such limited staff, we are a, quote, complaint-driven agency. So in order to have time to do the more thorough inspections that they have to do in response to tenant complaints, they keep the regular inspections as short as possible. They're in and out the door in 2 minutes. They just pressed buttons on smoke detectors. That's it. Now, the city publishes a long rental inspection checklist that they're supposed to use. They don't use it. They don't have time to use it. That's not what's actually happening. And so the other consequence of this short staffing is that not only are the regular inspections so superficial that they don't identify most violations, but when violations are identified, they take a ridiculously long time to follow up on them because they're so overburdened. So what they do now is that they take a whole month to follow up to see if an inspection's been corrected. What does that mean? Well, it means situations like the Carriage Hill Apartments fire of 2017, where code went in on January 30th, 2017, cited the landlord for multiple faulty smoke detectors and at least 1 expired fire extinguisher, didn't schedule the follow-up inspection until February 27th, and on February 26th, one of the buildings burnt down, displacing 41 tenants. Did they have adequate fire safety equipment? The city has no way of knowing. So those are the problems that we face as a result of understaffing. And, you know, people could have died from that in 2017. And if these problems don't get addressed, it's not just going to be an issue of security deposits being stolen and people having to live in overpriced, rundown conditions. It's likely going to lead to a loss of life, as it very well could have in 2017.
So at what point did you decide that you're going to run for mayor?
Well, so I was away from Athens from 2009 to 2016. And when I came back after living and renting in Pittsburgh, Portland, Oregon, Atlanta, Georgia, none of which were paradise by any means as far as rental, landlord-tenant issues were concerned, it was still a very rude awakening to come back to Athens and see how much lower the quality was for how much higher the price. And I initially got involved in city politics, not around rental housing issues, but around mobile vending issues.
Right.
Because I have a food truck. And, that situation showed me more about how city government works and doesn't work. And so that was very informative for thinking more about city politics. And so when I decided, to run for office, I didn't choose to focus on mobile vending issues because that doesn't affect anywhere near as many people as crucially as rental housing issues do. So that's where I turned my attention when I decided to run.
Was there a moment you had where, something clicked in your head that like, it's time to...
Well, there were lots of moments. I mean, and I've focused so much on rental housing, but there are other things that are terribly significant too. I mean, look at the situation with the arrest of the Baker 70 in 2017. I mean, that was absolutely historic. The second largest mass arrest of OU students in the university's 215-year history. And those were wrongful arrests. It was completely, if, and this is one of these absurd things about Athens. Like, back during the anti-war movement, I was arrested at a demonstration in Kent, Ohio.
Which anti-war movement?
Yeah, good question. The Iraq War. So this would have been, it was on the anniversary of the 1970 Kent State shootings. May 2003, there was a demonstration that coincided with that commemorative event at Kent State against the Iraq War. And I was arrested along with about a dozen other people, including a few people from Athens. And what came out in some of the subsequent criminal trials were that the police were directed to arrest anyone that they identified as a leader of the demonstration. Not anyone who was breaking any laws, but it was just, how can we shut down this demonstration? So I was then part of a successful wrongful arrest lawsuit against the city of Kent with about a dozen people. And, that happened because there was an attorney in Kent who was at the demonstration, who witnessed things and said, like, I don't want the police in my community behaving this way. I will, represent you all for free. I will do the work. Like, and we got it done. And, that's what should have happened after the Baker 70 situation here in Athens. But no local attorney stepped up to do that. And that was a situation where, and interestingly, the law in this area is the same body of case law that applies to high school student publications. It basically says that a publicly funded school has the right to constrain student speech if and only if school officials can show that censorship, whether that's banning a publication or dispersing a demonstration, that censorship is necessary to prevent a serious disruption of ordinary school proceedings or to protect the rights of bystanders. So that's what OU claimed had occurred, and that's what they failed to prove in court. That's why the original charges were dropped. But the problem was, before the original charges could be dropped, the city law office pressured 15 of those arrested into accepting conviction of lower but equally false charges on plea bargain. Those convictions still stand, even though the original charges were thrown out. And OU, of course, then followed up on those arrests with a blanket ban on indoor campus demonstrations, which was just blatantly unconstitutional. After a lot of public protest, they backed off on that.
Yeah.
But what's still in place is a ban on the fourth floor rotunda of Baker Center. Now, why that's ironic is because you can't just have blanket bans like that. It has to be based in particular circumstances where school officials can say that, like, look, if a demonstration happens in this particular spot, it will absolutely necessarily disrupt normal school proceedings. Well, the reason they lost their case is because they couldn't prove that in the Baker 70s arrest. So we already have a court case showing that a constitutionally permissible demonstration can occur in that area, yet OU retains this unconstitutional blanket ban. Now, why does that matter for city politics? Not only because students make up the majority of Athenians, of Athens city residents, but also because city government enabled those arrests, all those wrongful arrests. It wasn't just OUPD, it was APD backing them up, carrying out the arrests, and it was the city law office that chose to prosecute students on false charges. That's terribly significant. I mean, if it wasn't, if the rental housing stuff wasn't so awful, that's what I would focus on. So I think there's a lot. I mean, that alone would have convinced me to run for office.
Okay. And so, then you decided it's time to start this campaign. How do you think that your campaign ran, I guess? Like, are you satisfied with the campaign that you ran for mayor?
Well, I think it was a good trial run.
Okay.
I had never run for public office before. Ellie Hamrick had never run for public office before. Chris Monday had never run for public office before. And I think no one, certainly not in the last 20 years, has ever run the type of campaigns for Athens city office that we ran.
What do you mean?
Well, what I would really characterize as left-wing populist campaigns. We were trying to focus on the most important issues to the largest number of people. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to really enlarge local democracy by bringing new voters into the process. That was really our goal. And so, for instance, a friend of mine who actually served on city council several years ago in the beginning was like, well, you're focusing too much on rental housing issues because that's just going to appeal to students, and like students have never determined an election in Athens. Mm-hmm. And my response was, well, like, there's only a particular type of politician I'm interested in being. I'm more interested in achieving change than I am in getting elected.
Yeah.
So I think that we gave it the best shot we could on the first time around, and we learned a whole lot from the experience. And so there's tons of things, that I think that candidates like us will do differently second time around. So all in all, I think it was worthwhile, and we did a decent job, but we'll certainly do a better job in the future.
Okay. And so do you regret making students your primary target demographic?
No, because students make up 80% of the population. I mean, any politician who ignores them is just not interested in local democracy. That was kind of one of the ironies for me, is that when students got text messages from us, they were like, why am I getting it? They were annoyed by that.
Yeah.
I think they ought to be a little more annoyed by everybody who doesn't send them a text message and doesn't want them to vote, because they're more easily exploited as tenants and kind of oppressed by unconstitutional speech policies as students. So no, I mean, I think that anybody who's not interested in trying to win majority support is just not interested in democracy. That said, I think there was a problem with conflating students and renters, because there's a lot of people who rent in this town who aren't students. In fact, there's probably as many non-student renters as there are homeowners, because about 80% of the population is students, and about 80% of the residents are renters. But all first and second year students live on campus. So you take them out of that rental housing stock, and who replaces them? Well, it's all the folks who are uptown service workers and artists and musicians, basically the working class of our city that hasn't yet been totally priced out of town like most workers have. And so, there's a lot of anti-student sentiment in Athens, and it's kind of like the equivalent of scapegoating immigrants, but for Athens city politics. And, I would talk to people that were just so offended that I was trying to get students to vote. They were like, students shouldn't have any right to vote here. Mm-hmm. I mean, and these are like, progressive Democrats. These are like some homeowners who support Bernie Sanders,
yeah.
Literally. And they were saying that, like, look, students shouldn't vote here because they don't live here year round. Well, okay, so you're saying that because they only live here 70% of the year, they should vote where they live 30% of the year if they're not working a summer job or internship somewhere else? How does that make any sense? Or if somebody wants to get a degree, they should just forego voting rights for 4 or 5 years? And then the argument after that is, well, they vote on these property tax levies, and they're not the ones paying the property taxes. That's totally false. In a town where 72% of the housing stock is rental property and landlords are turning a profit, guess who's paying the vast majority of property tax? Students. They're just doing it through their rent.
What do you think of the argument that, well, yes, students are here for a significant part of time within those 4 years that they're here, even though, the 3 months that they go home for the summer and the month they're gone for winter break. But they're here for 3-4 years, then they leave and they don't come back, and the residents do have to deal with the consequences of elections, whether that be a public official or a ballot initiative.
So, I mean, when you graduate, you're going to move somewhere. Mm-hmm. How long do you have to live there before you think you should be able to vote? That's
a good question.
I mean, we don't have these things like residency requirements or poll taxes or voting as a property right. These are things that just aren't a part of democratic systems, and they're not a part of our political culture. They haven't been since we eliminated the last poll taxes. So, if you're going to live somewhere for a year, you should vote. Now, if you vote on matters that are going to affect people after you leave, Well, it's a different voting base after you leave. They can vote to change things. So there's no reason that students should not vote where they live 70% of the year while they're attending school.
Okay. And so I know that throughout your campaign, you spent a lot of time on the offense against Mayor Steve Patterson. Mm-hmm. Do you think that style negatively impacted voters' perception of you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends which voters. Because so here's the thing. I've talked a good bit in my campaign in terms of my background in grassroots organizing, but I have just as much experience in journalism. Over the last 24 years, I've worked as a magazine editor, a newspaper reporter, opinion columnist, a journalism educator. So the truth matters to me, and publicizing the truth matters to me. And, when Patterson or his supporters would put misinformation out there, I thought it was really important to counter that, just to set the record straight. Or when the local media would get things wrong, I'd feel the need to set the record straight. We just had the example, for instance, of covering turnout in this election. And was it unusually low? Cheers to you at the New Political, you got that right. The Athens News got it dead wrong. So, that was one of the things, then I have to spend all this time having an argument with Terry Smith. And there was a lot of that in the campaign. There was just a lot of misinformation, whether due to my opponent or his supporters being fairly disingenuous or just due to some journalism mishaps. And I thought it was necessary to correct some of those things. But unfortunately, people oftentimes weren't like, oh, cool, thanks. They were like, oh, you're overly confrontational.
I mean, whenever we ran a story that we did completely botch a point about you, and I was out, and then you sent us an email, and I was like, oh, God. And then I had to run home and fix it. And mind you, that's my job. I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to set the record straight. But, I certainly admire your willingness to want to get the truth out there, your willingness to press people in power to get the truth right, because that is what a journalist is supposed to do.
Well, can I say shit happens on your show? I don't know. But, shit happens. And so, I know that as working as a journalist, too. So it's not that, it's absolutely necessary to get it right on the first try, but if you get it wrong, you correct it. And I think the New Political was very good about that. Better than some other local publications. I mean, frankly, one of the things I focused on a lot was something that came out really early in the campaign. When I announced my campaign, the Athens News ran an article March 6th. They asked Mayor Patterson what he thought about it, and he responded by just, what I would characterize, and I'll defend this claim later if you want me to, lying about the number of rental housing inspectors and the number of annual inspections. What he said was he claimed that we basically have twice the number of actual inspectors responsible for performing half the number of actual inspections. He initially claimed that we had 6 rental housing inspectors, then he upped it to 7. And he claimed that they were only doing the regularly scheduled annual inspections, not all of the follow-up and the tenant complaint inspections too. Now, the day after that article was published, I emailed the Athens News the link to the city website where they'd find the annual code enforcement report stating that there are only 4 people performing inspections and only 3 of them working at any point in time, where they'd find the annual totals that were 8 and 10,000 for the most recent years, and the link to the rental housing inspection schedule, which the city also publishes, which lists each property inspected, what date it's to be inspected, and who the inspector is inspecting it. And guess what? There's only 4 people's names on that list, not 6 or 7. The Athens News not only sat on that for 5 months, but continued to republish the mayor's initial false claims in 2 subsequent stories. And so, I would fight with Terry Smith about this, and his response was, well, I'm being fair and balanced because I don't fact check either of you. And my response was, but, it kind of matters which one of us is telling the truth and which one of us isn't. And the reason I say that Mayor Patterson wasn't just wrong about those things, but was lying about them, was not only because I did what I could to publicize the correct information immediately thereafter and he never responded, but also because in one of the follow-up articles, he specifically said the 2018 Code Enforcement Report says that there are 7 inspectors. And the 2018 Code Enforcement Report says that there are 4 inspectors. So even if you just want to say, well, was he telling the truth about what the report said? No. But it wasn't until I finally pressured the Athens News to do a more substantial story where they corrected that they finally got him to walk that back and say, oh, okay, I guess there's 4. Sorry, I've been lying for 5 months. So I think those things were important. And I think that if the Athens News, and I also shared that information with the Post from the beginning, they never published it, had done more fact-checking, it would have made some difference. I don't think it would have changed the final outcome. But again, like, the truth just matters. Like, it matters whether that helps me win or not, is my perspective.
Yeah. So it's been about a little over a week since Election Day. How do you feel about the results of the election 1 week out? You got about 20% of the vote. Mayor Patterson got about 75%. So it was, for all intents and purposes, a landslide loss.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, Mayor Patterson got, about 436 fewer votes than he got last time. Now, that's something. And I have a feeling that most of those were people who did vote for him last time, because I don't think we succeeded in dramatically increasing student turnout or just working class renter turnout much, despite substantial efforts. So, I think we started chipping away at things, but the real issue, I think, is that, and I haven't had time to do as detailed a study of this yet as I would like, but if you look at the precinct data, you can get some approximation of the demographics of voters. So, for instance, I live in the 4th Ward, which covers the affluent Near East Side, predominantly homeowner neighborhood, and I believe encompasses Mill Street as well, encompasses some student areas. The city's gerrymandered to try to prevent students from ever electing a representative to city council. So there's not like one ward that's all students. It's divided up between all 4 wards, but each ward has a large student section that encompasses a couple precincts. So the predominantly homeowner occupied neighborhoods or precincts in the 4th Ward voted at about 45%. There are 2 precincts in the 4th Ward that are predominantly renter. They voted at 3% and 4% respectively. Mayor Patterson's neighborhood, which I believe he lives in the same precinct as everybody's pal John Wharton, that precinct voted at 55% turnout. The precinct where University Commons apartment complex is located voted 1.4%. So overall, once I do a more detailed study, I'm guessing that the final picture will be that homeowners voted at about 10 times the rate of renters, or more. And so, that's the real question, is that we're not going to get policy that's in the best interests of the majority if we don't reach out to the majority, if we don't mobilize the majority to vote. And, it's going to take a while to build that voting base, and unfortunately, we only have 4 or 5 years to do it.
Why is that?
Well, because students graduate and leave.
And then and then the new people who come in have to learn who you are.
Exactly.
And become acquainted with you. Okay.
Exactly. But there still can be a cumulative effect because everybody doesn't leave at once. So, we reached some students who were first and second year students this year when we were canvassing the dining halls, and they were like, well, why should I register? Well, 2 years from now, some slumlord's going to steal their deposit. They're going to live in a horribly rundown place, and they're going to say, oh, I remember some people were talking to me about this. So it is a long-term project, and I think it's possible, but we certainly weren't able to get there this time around.
Why do you think that is?
I think that, if you just look at voter turnout, engagement with the electoral system in the U.S., the U.S. has atypically low turnout for contemporary liberal capitalist democracies. And in particular, which demographics don't vote? Well, young people, vote at a very low rate. Students vote at a very low rate. So do poor and working class people. The constituencies that in multi-party parliamentary democracies with proportional representation, where you have, labor parties, socialist parties, the constituencies that vote for those parties in other countries just don't vote in the U.S. Because there's no party that represents their interests. So, that's the national context, and then Athens is the local context. Well, that national picture is true, then plus the fact that, you've got young people who are here as students. Maybe they don't, still identify as living in Athens yet, even though it is where they live 70% of the year for the next 4 to 5 years. So, there are local barriers to engaging a majority of eligible voters, and there are national barriers too. I mean, we kind of have to face all those problems here in Athens.
What did you expect your percentage of the vote share would be?
Higher than it was.
Like, do you have a number estimate?
Oh, I mean, I didn't think me winning was the most likely outcome, but I thought it was within the realm of possibility. And, when I think of all the things that we did to try to get more people registered and to get more people to vote than any candidate that I'm aware of has done in the 13 years that I've lived here and the 20 years that I've followed city politics, I thought we would have had a better response rate. I mean, those text messages that we sent out, I did one round, Ellie's campaign did one round. They probably each went out to maybe 10,000 people. We had 200 or 300 of those people click on the online voter registration link. So very low success rate.
Yeah.
And door to door and canvassing at the dining halls was a pretty low success rate too. For me, it's really funny, right? Because I've been involved in a lot of controversial left-wing activism. I was getting arrested in the anti-war movement during the brief period when the Iraq War was popular. I've done a lot of stuff that at the time was pretty controversial. So I thought, trying to register people to vote, that's something that my high school teachers would be proud of me for. And, when I approached most people just asking if they were registered to vote, they looked at me like I either had the plague or had insulted their mother, And I think that that's how not just foreign, but offensive the idea of voting is to most people. And I understand why, but it's something we have to get past.
Yeah, so I'm just curious. I know that you used your hot potato food truck as a voter registration station, essentially. I mean, you kind of just make, how would I say? You did a remodel job to it, I guess. Where'd you get that idea? I'm just curious.
Well, the whole time that I was focusing on grassroots organizing and activism in Athens, you have to get the word out somehow. And one thing that makes a lot of our smaller, independent, locally owned businesses better than their ubiquitous corporate chain store counterparts is that a lot of them have bulletin boards up. And, they let you put stuff on their counters, or, Casa has that shelf, Donkey has that shelf, Village Bakery has that shelf. And so, those were always avenues for getting the word out. I mean, during the anti-war movement, there were uptown businesses that sold bus tickets for us, at their counter, like sold a sandwich, sold a bus ticket to go to DC to protest the war. So when I opened my own food truck with my background in organizing, I always had that in mind. And, I had, flyers for different things up occasionally, but when I ran for office, of course, I had this big canvas on the one side that was blank. So I think it was just natural to think about using that avenue in my own business that I had previously used in so many others' businesses.
And the primary target for your campaign was students. So you had it set practically on campus. I mean, not technically, but do you think that, well, actually I should ask, was that successful? Did you see people coming to your truck to register to vote? Were they coming and picking up literature? Were they engaging with you when you were out there?
Yes, but nowhere near as many as I would have hoped. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, everything we did had a pretty low success rate. And I think that in order for candidates like us to win, we would really need to do much more face-to-face, longer conversations, actual real-life organizing, not social media, not like going around with like clipboards just seeing if people are registered or sending them texts, but actually engaging people more substantially. Now, the problem with that is it's incredibly resource intensive.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about the investment of time, the investment of, even if it's just lost wages when people could be working elsewhere, it's a huge investment of money. So, but that's still the challenge we face.
Are you optimistic about the future of your cause and, the other socialists around town like Chris Munday and Ellie Hamrick?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you don't always have to win an election to win change. I mean, simply by running for office, we got city council to pass more pro-tenant legislation than it's done in decades. And, that battle's not over by any means. They increased the penalties for multi
landlords who commit multiple
exactly
offenses.
multiple offenders. But the city law director has never enforced what the housing code says anyway. So, we have to make sure she's actually going to enforce those penalties, and she's never enforced the penalties in the past. But still, I mean, that was huge progress. That's something that hasn't been done in decades. And we just did it by shaming and scaring, public officials. So, yeah, absolutely. We can, I think that ongoing tenant activism, whether it's in the form of a robust tenant union or even a smaller tenant activist group, can achieve a lot of the things we set out in Operation Slumlord Smackdown.
I want to talk about campaign fundraising because you spent, let me get this correct. So you matched Mayor Patterson's fundraising almost, and you paid it almost entirely out of pocket.
Yeah.
How'd you do that? Because I mean, Mayor Patterson got most of that money from donors.
Yeah. Well, and it was fascinating once the reports were finally filed, because I had no idea how much money he was raising or spending. I didn't know if I was going to end up spending a lot less or a lot more than he did. So it was interesting to see that it was so close in terms of money that we raised, but I spent significantly more of that money than he did, at least by the time of our October 16th, cutoff point.
Right.
But I had more money than I initially expected through random things. I had a family member pass away and leave a little bit of money. I had somebody wreck my car, and I got an insurance payment out of that. And thankfully, I'm not working a minimum wage job at the moment. I'm not making a lot of money, but for so long, I was so broke that I still have a hard time finding things to spend it on. Why not spend it on this?
Can I ask what your day job is?
So I do social media consultancy primarily for an Instagram marketing company.
Okay.
So that's what pays my bills. Really, the food truck at this point is just an expensive policy because the city is just trying to do away with food trucks by making it impossible for them to have viable businesses. So, the food truck doesn't pay my bills. But yeah, that was kind of interesting because really there's no way for a left-wing populist to raise that kind of money from donors in this town, okay? Because if you're trying to represent low-income renters, they don't have that kind of disposable income. Even though there's a lot more of them, it's still harder for them to give. If you look at Patterson, his again single biggest donor was a landlord. So were some of the other major donors.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I think you were going to interject something there.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. And so yeah, Alan McMillan's not going to give me money. John Wharton's not going to give me money. Right. Robert Leslie Cornwell's not going to give me money. So yeah, it makes it so much harder to represent a working class agenda because it's a lot harder to come up with the money. And so I had to spend it out of pocket.
Did you actively try to fundraise?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you're not opposed to taking money from...
Well, I wouldn't take money from the folks that Patterson took money from, even if they wanted to give it to me, which I'm sure they never would. But
such as landowners?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if Alan McMillan wants to give me money, I'm doing something wrong. If John Wharton wants to give me money, I'm doing something wrong. And so I wouldn't accept their money, but I'm sure they would never want to give it to me anyway. But no, I did some fundraising. So it was a link from my website. I posted stuff on social media. There was one fundraising event that the folks from the Columbus chapter of Democratic Socialists of America organized that was kind of a joint fundraising event for me and also for Liliana Rivera Bayman, who ran for Columbus City Council with the SA's endorsement. And so all in all, I raised about $1,500 from individual donors. Yeah. And out of close to 8,000 total. Yeah. That's where I ended up.
If you could run again, what would you do differently?
Lots of things. And I mean, I'm still thinking about that a lot. But I think that from the outset, I thought, okay, I'm going to have limited funding. I expected to have a lot less than I did. So how do you make the most of that funding? And it seemed like social media would be the way to make the most of it. And I think that one lesson from this was that social media is absolutely no substitute for face-to-face organizing. So whatever resources I had to devote to a future campaign would much more be directed at face-to-face organizing, and starting farther in advance. One of the reasons that the deck is stacked against students is that students usually move to a different address every year, and there's only 6 weeks from the beginning of fall semester until the deadline to register to vote at your new address. And that's the first 6 weeks of the semester when you've got a lot of other things on your mind. So, there's such a narrow window to try to get students registered. And again, there's been this tendency to talk about students a lot, but really I would say the primary group I wanted to mobilize were renters. And while, yes, students are the majority of renters, there are probably also as many working class renters in Athens as there are homeowners. Not as much of a focus on social media, much more of a focus on face-to-face organizing.
Do you have any ideas of what that might look like apart from just, door to door or having events and things like that?
I think it would involve really starting off at the very beginning of the year or even earlier.
Beginning of the academic year?
Well, no, the beginning of the calendar year.
Gotcha.
During which an election is going to occur. And trying to mobilize a core group of people who will then work on mobilizing more and more of their friends as time goes on, trying to find more of a way for people to, make a commitment, make a pledge to vote or to, get so many of their friends to vote, and definitely having more events. One thing that was extremely frustrating too when it came to students was that we were not able to get a student organization to hold an on-campus candidate forum before the registration deadline. That was incredibly frustrating because I approached undergraduate and graduate student senate, and they were like, yeah, we can't do it in time because we have to, make sure we find a date that works for everyone. And then they just ended up picking a date anyway without consulting anyone. So of course it could have happened before the deadline. Unfortunately, those groups just didn't want to make it happen. It was some poorly promoted event that, maybe 30 students showed up to. That could actually be done the right way before the deadline, have a massive turnout, and could have an impact on the election. So things like that, I think, could be done much differently, much better.
What's next for you?
One way or another, more of the same. I'm going to continue working on these same issues, whether through grad or with an eye towards future political campaigns. That's what I do.
Any city council or mayoral campaigns in the future for you?
Oh, potentially. I definitely want to see somebody with an agenda like me, and preferably several somebodies run 2 years from now in the city council race. And I also think that it might be worth looking at whether we can pass some of the changes we would like to pass through ballot initiatives. That's how Taco got passed, for instance. Taco had overwhelming public support, and Pat McGee was the only elected official who would come out in favor of it. And it passed by a wide margin. So I think there are lots of opportunities.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
That's about it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
And that wraps it up here on Athens Happens. Make sure to tune in every Friday for new episodes that shed light on the politics that impact all of our lives. Remember, you can find the show on the New Political's website, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and on YouTube in a video podcast format. Also, be sure to check out our website at thenewpolitical.com, where we regularly report stories on what really happens here in Athens, and follow @thenewpolitical on social media. Thank you all so much. Have a great week.